termination is governed by what we call the Qatari Labor Law, which was the law number 14 of 2004. However, something that you need to understand, it was amended by law 21 of 2015, terminating the job contract in Qatar. It can happen in either two situations, either by the employee or even by the employer. However, something that you need to understand, both parties, the employer and the employee, both parties have rights and obligations under the law, and here can be the best option for you to understand what it's all about when you are going to terminate the employment contract, either you the employer or what you call the employee. By the way, is it your first time to come up? In Qatar, job termination or contract termination is governed by what we call the Qatari Labor Law, which was the law number 14 of 2004. However, something that you need to understand, it was amended by law 21 of 2015, terminating the job contract in Qatar. It can happen in either two situations, either by the employee or even by the employer. However, something that you need to understand, both parties, the employer and the employee, both parties have rights and obligations under the law, and here can be the best option for you to understand what it's all about when you are going to terminate the employment contract, either you the employer or what you call the employee. By the way, is it your first time to come across Mexcreationtv? Don't hesitate to subscribe and don't hesitate to follow. In today's video, we are going to see some of the very important tricks that most of you need to learn when it comes to what we call an employment contract or terminating what we call an employment contract. Remember, terminating an employment contract, there are clauses that govern both sides, that is the employer and what we call the employee. We are going to try to look at to break through all the different situations that may lead either for the employer to terminate or even the employee to terminate the contract by himself. By the way, is it your first time to come across this Mexcreation? Don't hesitate. Let's get straight into the video and see what could happen. Terminating what we call the employment contract by what we call the employer. The employer can terminate the contract for the employee under different reasons or the various reasons that can be or can lead to a termination of that contract. Let us try to look at what we call the justified reasons. Why may your employer terminate the contract using what we call the justified reasons? The employer can terminate that contract with what we call valid cause and some common reasons why your employer may terminate your contract as the employee. One may be misconduct, negligence, violence, insubordination, violation of the company policy. Then also we have things like incompetence. The employee may fail to meet up the standards and violating what we call the company, receiving proper trainings and warnings. Then we have absenteeism. Unjustified absence from work for a long period of time. Your employer has a right to terminate what you call your employment contract. Then we have what we call criminal conviction. If the employee is convicted of a crime, particularly one related to what we call the work or businesses, then your employer has the right to terminate your contract. That is what we call the justified reasons under which the employer has a right to terminate your contract. So you need to be very, very careful. However, when you look at situations that if the employer terminates the contract with various reasons, they are not required even to pay you what you call severance or what you call end of service salary, even annual leave, because he has a right not to pay you according to the law. But they must settle the employee's dues, which the employees, such as unpaid salary and leave, yes, they must settle them accordingly to what could be an agreed cause of it all in either way. Then let us try to look at situation B for those what we call terminating your contract with what you call without cause or unjustified reasons. What are your entitlements? Yes, most of you have fallen into culprits, especially to jobs whereby your contracts are being terminated. Let's say, for example, your employer terminates you from nowhere. Something that you need to understand, if a contract is terminated without notice, without any valid reason, this is what you call unjustified reasons, then probably what you need to know, you are entitled to your end of service bonus. The employee is entitled to end of service bonus that will be calculated based on what you call the length of the employment. You are entitled to for every service, for the first years, for the first week. Then also you are entitled to what you call the notice period. Though most of you being terminated without genuine reasons and you don't still, you're not given what you call a notice period for that regard. But if your employer terminates your contract without proof or without justified reason, with unjustified reasons, let's say he doesn't know or just all over the blue, he wakes up to terminate your contract according to the law here, then that employer has to give you all what you call your end of service bonus, then also unpaid salary, all compensations have to be paid for you in that regard. Then someone else asked me a question. What happens if, or what happened to the, what you call, if the employer terminates me during what you call probation period? That's also another situation. If the employer, if an employee is terminated during what you call the probation period, usually you get to find that the probation period, for example, here in Qatar is between 3 to 6 months, depending on the company. The employer can terminate the contract without even any compensation. Yes, he has the right, because this is probation period. He's still testing how resilient and how better you can suit to a company requirement. So he will terminate you without even compensation for that regard. Otherwise, unless it was stated in what we call an employment contract, in those due, then probably definitely that one he can definitely pay you. Then we have what you call termination of the employee. Remember, in this kind of situation, we have where the employee himself, you the person yourself, you want to terminate the contract with the company. Yes, you want to terminate the contract with the company. There are those situations that we've received where you yourself, you wake up and like, okay, myself, I want to terminate the contract with this company. What do you need to do? Yes, an employee can also terminate a job contract voluntarily without anyone forcing. But remember, there are rules and conditions that definitely you need to adhere to. And one of them is what you call resignation. Voluntary termination. You have to resign. If the employee decides to resign and terminate the contract, then you must provide what you call a notice period. Usually it is within 1 month to 2 months, depending on the length of how you've worked with that company. Yes, compensation. In case the employee resigns without giving a proper notice, then they may have to compensate the employee for breaching what you call the contract. However, the resignation is due to specific reasons. It can have a bare reason for you. It can be because of different reasons. Let's say, for example, harassment, unsafe working conditions. Yes, the employer may not be reliable to what you call compensation. Then we have, under the employee, we also look at what you call resignation during probation period. Yes, during probationary period, the employee can terminate an employment contract without what you call a notice period. But it is important, normally, most of the times, to check the specific terms of the contract before you want to terminate a contract during what you call the probation period. Then we have an employee can also terminate a contract due to what you call harassment, breach of the contract. Yes, if the employee resigns due to harassment, an employer, violation of the contract, providing what was agreed upon or benefit, the employer can terminate the contract without any penalty, and the employee can be required to pay what you call severance benefits in that regard. Then let us look at situation 3. Termination of what you call the termination of the contract by what you call the mutual agreement. In this contract can be terminated between what you call the mutual agreement between the employer and the employee. In these situations, both parties agree to settle their issue, terminate the contract without even having to pay. You remember, both the employer and the employer should sign what you call a termination agreement that clearly states the terms of separation, including settlement dues and any payment, and release from further obligations of any situations. So probably that's what definitely should understand. Then we have another kind of termination, for example, termination due to forced merger. For example, certain exceptional situations, Maybe natural disaster, either war, unforeseen events may either allow the employer or the employee to terminate what you call a contract due to what you call the force majeure. However, something that you need to understand, that when it comes to termination due to this category, such circumstances may be subject to what we call the legal review and are not always automatically accepted. Yes, remember, in these situations, it is the legal action that is supposed to determine whether the termination is law legal or non-legal. Then we have what you call end of service and benefits and final settlements upon termination of what you call a contract, either by the employee or either by the employer. Both parties are entitled to what we call settlement, which include unpaid salary, annual leave, end of service benefits, and gratuity in that regard. Employees who have worked for more than 1 year of a company are entitled to end of service gratuity based on the salary of the year of service. Probably that's what definitely should understand. Then when we look at what we call repatriation of workers, also repatriation of foreigner workers. Most of you have been to companies and you are asking for annual flight tickets to go back to your country. Yes, something that definitely should understand. Who is responsible for the repatriations? An employer of foreign upon termination of the employment contract is typically required to bear the cost of repatriation, especially the employee in one of who is terminates the contract. Yes, for example, if you decide to terminate, if the employer decides to terminate his contract, yes, depending on the kind of situation, you may be required to what you call to repatriate yourself to go back to your country. Then also we look at some situations whereby we have dispute resolutions. For example, if termination leads to what you call a debt dispute, an employer can approach. If both of you, let's say there is a termination and both of you've not agreed, especially in Qatar, I always advise people that the best thing for you to go, you go and approach the Ministry of Labor Department, Administrative Labor Department, to try to sort out such kind of situations or issues, such that both of you, the employer and the employee, get to settle out in a very good way in other terms. What are some of the key takeaways? What would be the best advice for people who are going to terminate the contracts, for you who are wishing to terminate the contracts? Most of the times, remember the very important things that definitely you should understand, that both the employer and the employee must adhere to what was outlined in what we call the employment contract, according to the Qatari Labor Law. Notice period, compensation, severe pay, important considerations during what you call termination must be also respected. Employees are also entitled to what you call end of service bonus upon what you call the terminations. Most of you have been sent into the company, terminated in the company, and you're not given what you call your end of service bonus. And if they're there too, then you must have completed service, then you are there to give it to. Then both parties can resolve dispute through what you call the labor department or what we call the labor court. Normally, most of the times, I always tell people, check the specific contract terms for any violations, for any general rules and guidance. Hope I've tried to share something for you. For a person who was really asking me about terminations of employment contracts in Qatar, definitely according to the law, and definitely that's what you need to understand and know. Thank you so much. Remember, sorry, Max from Mexcreation.